They stood beside me for 25 years, took my loyalty, took my silence, took my strength, and the moment my job disappeared, so did the woman who once swore she never would. I didn't argue when the call ended. I didn't beg when the door closed. I didn't ask her to stay when she packed light and walked out heavy with certainty. What stayed with me was the timing. Perfect. Clean. Almost rehearsed. For 25 years, I gave my life to one place and my trust to one person. I believed consistency was protection. I believed showing up every day mattered. I believed that if you stayed loyal long enough, life would notice. That belief died the same week my job did. The job wasn't glamorous. It never was. But it was solid. Respectable. A place where people nodded when you passed. A place that quietly told the world you belonged somewhere. I arrived early. I stayed late. I fixed problems that weren't mine and carried blame that should have been shared. I didn't complain. I didn't threaten. I didn't play games. I thought that made me safe. The meeting was short. Too short for 25 years. They spoke in calm voices. Professional voices. Voices trained to sound sympathetic while saying nothing that could be held against them. Words like restructuring, market shift, new direction. All clean words. No blood on them. I nodded. I thanked them. I shook hands that had already let go of me. By the time I reached the parking lot, my phone vibrated. Not with concern. Not with comfort. With distance. She had already decided. When I told her, there was a pause. Not shock. Not fear. A pause like someone checking a watch. Measuring something they had already measured before. She said she needed space. She said she needed stability. She said she didn't know who I was anymore. That last one stayed with me. Because I knew exactly who I was. I was just no longer useful. The house changed quickly after that. Conversations shortened. Eye contact faded. Plans were suddenly uncertain. The silence grew teeth. And I understood something then that no one teaches you when you're young. Loyalty is only admired when it's profitable. She didn't leave in anger. She didn't leave in tears. She left like someone stepping off a train they never planned to ride to the end. No screaming. No accusations. Just a quiet exit and a sentence that felt rehearsed. I can't live like this. What she meant was, I won't wait. That night, I sat alone in a house filled with things we chose together, realizing none of them had chosen me back. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was alert. Because betrayal doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, packs neatly, and locks the door behind it. And that's when I understood something else. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment the story finally told the truth. I didn't sleep much after she left. Not because I missed her voice, but because the silence kept answering questions I had ignored for years. The house felt the same, yet different. Like a stage after the actors leave. Everything in place. Nothing alive. I walked through rooms slowly, not searching for memories, but noticing absences. Her mug gone. Her shoes missing. Her side of the closet suddenly lighter, as if her commitment had always weighed less than mine. People think betrayal arrives with chaos. It doesn't. It arrives with order. I sat at the kitchen table where we had planned futures that depended on my stability and her patience. Funny thing was, my stability had always been the foundation. Her patience had been conditional. I just didn't see the fine print. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. 25 years of routine doesn't disappear overnight. I showered, dressed, and for a moment reached for my keys before remembering there was nowhere I was expected to go. That realization hurt more than the job loss. Work had been simple. Show up. Solve problems. Stay quiet. Earn trust. I gave them my best years, not because they demanded it, but because I believed consistency meant respect. I watched younger men rise faster, not because they were better, but because they were louder. I stayed steady. I stayed useful. I stayed replaceable. I didn't fight it when they let me go. Power doesn't fear anger. It fears patience. And patience was something I still had plenty of. What surprised me was how quickly people stopped calling. Colleagues who once needed advice suddenly needed distance. Friends who praised my work ethic now spoke in careful tones, as if misfortune were contagious. And then there was her. She didn't block me. She didn't disappear completely. She checked in just enough to ease her conscience. Messages without warmth. Questions without curiosity. Each word chosen to confirm her decision, not reconsider it. I replied politely, briefly, calmly. I wasn't going to beg for loyalty from someone who rented it. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a quiet kind of clarity. I began to notice patterns that had been invisible before. How often my opinions had been corrected. How my risks had been discouraged. How my sacrifices had been accepted without acknowledgement. Love, I learned, can become a transaction if you're the only one paying. One afternoon, while sorting old documents, I found a letter from my first year at the company. A handwritten note from a supervisor long retired. It thanked me for reliability. Not brilliance. Not innovation. Reliability. Back then, that felt like a compliment. Now it felt like a warning. Reliability makes you dependable. Dependable makes you invisible. Invisible makes you expendable. I folded the letter carefully and put it away. Not out of nostalgia, but as evidence. Proof that I hadn't imagined the slow shift from valued to convenient. The money situation tightened. I adjusted without drama. Cut unnecessary expenses. Sold things I didn't need. Pride doesn't pay bills, and panic clouds judgment. I stayed calm. Watched. Planned. She noticed the changes too. Her messages changed tone. Less concern. More distance. It was as if my struggle confirmed her choice, and that confirmation brought her peace. That's when something inside me settled. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped justifying my past. I stopped defending my future. I wasn't going to prove my worth to someone who measured it by momentum. Late one evening, as the house grew quiet again, I realized something important. This wasn't just about losing a job or a marriage. It was about seeing clearly for the first time. I had confused endurance with love. I had mistaken silence for loyalty. I had believed that staying was the same as being chosen. Those beliefs cost me years. But they also gave me something rare. Time. Time to observe. Time to prepare. Time to let people reveal themselves without interruption. Because the truth is, when everything is taken from you calmly, you learn how to take everything back the same way. And I wasn't finished yet. The strange thing about losing everything quietly is that no one notices when you start rebuilding in silence. I kept my days simple. Mornings stayed early. Coffee stayed black. I walked the same streets, nodded at the same faces, lived inside the same skin. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was important. Change attracts attention. Stillness invites underestimation. I began reviewing my past with honesty instead of nostalgia. Not the highlights. The overlooked moments. The times I had been passed over. The meetings where decisions were made before I entered the room. The projects that carried my fingerprints but someone else's signature. I wasn't bitter. Bitterness clouds memory. I was precise. She reached out less now. When she did, her words were lighter, almost relieved. As if distance had confirmed a version of me she needed to believe in. I could hear it between her sentences. She was already telling people her story. I let her. People rarely question the person who leaves. They question the one who remains quiet. I took notes. Not on paper. In my head. Dates. Reactions. Who said what after I lost my position? Who vanished? Who suddenly offered advice instead of opportunity? Patterns always emerge when you stop rushing past them. One afternoon, a former colleague called. Casual voice. friendly enough. He mentioned a role opening at a company that worked closely with my old one. He asked questions that sounded innocent but felt rehearsed. About what I knew, what I suspected, what I thought had gone wrong. I answered carefully, truthfully, but not completely. That call told me more than he intended. They weren't done with me. They just assumed I was. At night, I thought about loyalty. How easily people praise it when it benefits them. How quickly they distance themselves when it becomes inconvenient. I realized loyalty without leverage is just obedience wearing a better name. And I had been obedient for a long time. The house felt less heavy now. Not emptier. Lighter. Like a place that had stopped holding its breath. I rearranged furniture. Not for comfort. For clarity. Each change was small. Controlled. Intentional. I wasn't reacting. I was resetting. She sent a message one evening that confirmed everything I needed to know. It was short, polite, final. She wished me the best, and said she hoped I would find my footing. People say things like that when they believe you won't. I read it once, then deleted it. Not out of anger, out of accuracy. That night, I sat alone and allowed myself one honest thought. Not revenge. Not sadness. Recognition. They all believed my value ended when my position did. That belief was going to cost them more than they imagined. Because when you're no longer trying to be understood, you're free to move without explanation. And when people stop watching you closely, they give you room to act. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to correct any stories. I didn't need to demand fairness. Time was already doing that work for me. The truth has a way of surfacing when no one is trying to bury it. And as I turned off the lights that night, calm and clear, I understood something deeply. This was only the beginning. They reassigned my life the same way they reassigned my work, quietly, efficiently, without asking whether I agreed. That thought stayed with me as part 2 began, because once the shock faded, something colder took its place. Not anger. Awareness. I had time now. Too much of it, according to people who still believed movement was proof of value. They asked what I was doing next, how long I planned to wait, whether I was worried. I told them I was thinking. That answer made them uncomfortable. Thinking looks like idleness to people who fear stillness. The neighborhood hadn't changed. Same trimmed lawns. Same polite waves. Same early morning joggers chasing youth and late evening couples pretending to talk while avoiding truth. From the outside, my life looked paused. From the inside, it was reorganizing. I began to see my past not as a single long effort, but as a collection of moments where I had chosen restraint over reaction. At work. At home. Everywhere. I had learned early that calm men are trusted. I had not learned that calm men are often used. The job had been my identity because it was easy to explain. A title. A paycheck. A schedule. It spared me the harder question of who I was without utility. Losing it forced that question into the open. At first, I avoided answering it. I cleaned. I organized. I fixed small things around the house. The kind of work that gives your hands purpose while your mind avoids responsibility. But eventually, the quiet grew honest. I started reviewing old files on my computer. Reports. Emails. Projects I had led without credit. Decisions I had advised against that later failed spectacularly. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting truth. Patterns are clearer in hindsight. I noticed how often my warnings had been softened, reworded, delayed. How frequently I had been asked to smooth things over rather than solve them properly. I had been useful because I absorbed consequences without complaint. That role doesn't survive restructuring. I remembered the day they promoted someone younger over me. Less experienced. More confident. He thanked me privately for setting things up so well. I smiled then. I understand now what that moment cost me. At home, I began cooking for one without ceremony. No plates set across from mine. No conversation to maintain. Just nourishment. Practical. Efficient. I slept better than I expected. Loneliness wasn't the problem people make it out to be. Uncertainty is worse. She didn't call anymore. That was fine. Silence had clarified her position better than words ever could. I wondered if she missed me or simply missed the version of life that required less courage. People don't leave because you fall. They leave because they don't want to stand still long enough to see you rise. I went to the library one afternoon. Not to read, but to observe. Older men sat quietly, surrounded by knowledge no one had asked them for in years. They weren't bitter. They were invisible. I wondered how many of them had once been essential. That thought sharpened something in me. I didn't want to disappear politely. So I began reaching out, not widely, but carefully. Former contacts. Not the obvious ones. The quiet professionals who had noticed details. People who listened more than they spoke. I asked how they were. I didn't mention my situation unless they did. Most conversations ended quickly. A few lingered. One of them spoke about a consulting project that had stalled. Leadership issues. Internal confusion. Familiar symptoms. He asked what I thought. I asked questions instead. The kind that make people uncomfortable because they expose assumptions. By the end of the call, his tone had changed. We didn't make plans. We didn't need to. The door had opened enough. I didn't rush through it. That was the lesson of the past 25 years. Speed impresses. Patience endures. Meanwhile, stories about me were circulating. I heard fragments through mutual acquaintances. That I had lost my edge. That I was struggling to adapt. That I had been too rigid for modern environments. Funny how words change when you're no longer in the room. I let them talk. Reputation is loud when you defend it. Quiet when it defends itself. At night, I wrote nothing down. No journals. No letters. Just mental outlines. If I was going to move forward, it would be clean. No emotional residue. No dramatic gestures. Quiet alignment between intention and action. I remembered something an older colleague once told me early in my career. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits until you stop looking for it. I finally understood what he meant. Losing my job had removed expectations. Losing my marriage had removed distractions. What remained was focus. Not revenge. Not yet. Preparation. Because calm men don't explode. They reposition. And in repositioning, they let the world underestimate them just long enough to make the correction permanent. I noticed how differently people spoke to me once I no longer had a title to introduce myself with. Conversations shortened. Questions became vague. Advice replaced interest. It was subtle, but consistent. Respect, I learned, is often rented. I adjusted my expectations accordingly. I stopped filling silences. Let people speak themselves empty. When they asked what I was doing now, I said I was listening. That answer confused them. It also ended most conversations quickly. Confusion is a kind of truth. I spent long afternoons walking without destination. Not to escape thinking, but to give it room. Movement helps thoughts fall into order. Each step stripped away another illusion I had carried for years. The illusion that loyalty alone builds security. The illusion that effort is always noticed. The illusion that love is unconditional when comfort is at stake. I didn't resent her for leaving. Resentment assumes surprise. I wasn't surprised anymore. I was disappointed in myself for ignoring the signs because they were inconvenient. She had always admired certainty, status, momentum. I had provided those for a long time. When they disappeared, so did the version of me she respected. That wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Clarity hurts once. Denial hurts every day. I began to remember arguments we never finished. Moments I softened truths to keep peace. Times I accepted blame to avoid discomfort. I thought I was being kind. I was being convenient. At work, it had been the same. I carried responsibility quietly, smoothed tensions, took on problems others avoided. People thanked me. Promotions went elsewhere. I used to think that was coincidence. It wasn't. Organizations and relationships operate on similar principles. They reward visibility, not depth. Noise, not substance. Calm competence is valuable only until it challenges hierarchy. Once I understood that, I stopped mourning what I lost. I started respecting what I had learned. I received another call from the same former colleague a week later. This time, his questions were more direct. He asked how I would handle a certain conflict. I answered honestly, simply, without embellishment. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what I thought too, but no one here wants to say it." That sentence told me everything. People don't lack insight. They lack permission. We spoke again a few days later. Still no commitments. Just exchanges of perspective. He mentioned how leadership dismissed concerns until problems became unavoidable. How decisions were driven by optics. How accountability traveled downward, never up. I listened more than I spoke. That was my advantage. I wasn't auditioning. I wasn't selling. I wasn't desperate. Desperation always asks for approval. I was offering clarity. In the evenings, I noticed how quiet the house stayed now. Not tense. Honest. I ate when I was hungry. Slept when I was tired. No negotiations. No emotional budgeting. Freedom doesn't arrive loudly. It settles. I stopped checking messages so often. If something mattered, it would find me. If it didn't, I didn't need to chase it. She sent one more message. A practical one. About paperwork. Neutral. Efficient. I replied the same way. Two strangers coordinating logistics. Whatever connection we had once shared had already been processed. That realization didn't break me. It freed me. I thought about how much energy I had spent maintaining appearances. Stability. Harmony. Success. All things that looked solid from the outside but required constant adjustment underneath. Now, there was nothing to maintain. I wasn't rebuilding the old life. I was designing a new one with fewer dependencies. Another contact reached out. This one more cautious. He had heard I was available. I let the word hang between us. Available for what, exactly? He spoke about opportunities without describing responsibilities. About collaboration without defining authority. I asked one question. Who carries the consequences? He didn't answer immediately. People rarely do when they haven't considered that part. When he did respond, it was with uncertainty. That uncertainty told me more than any offer could have. I declined politely. Without explanation. Without apology. Saying no felt unfamiliar. Powerful. Clean. I wasn't in a rush to belong again. Belonging had cost me too much already. What I wanted now was alignment. Between effort and outcome. Between truth and action. Between silence and strength. I noticed something else during this time. The people who had benefited most from my past loyalty were the ones most eager to define my present as failure. It made sense. My success outside their system would challenge the story they needed to tell themselves. I let them keep their story. Stories collapse on their own when reality stops supporting them. Late one night, I sat in the dark and understood the shape of what was coming. Not a dramatic reversal. Not a public reckoning. Something quieter. More permanent. The kind of shift that doesn't need witnesses. I wasn't planning revenge. I was positioning myself where truth would do the work for me. Because when you remove emotion from the equation, consequences tend to land exactly where they belong. And I was finally patient enough to let that happen. I stopped explaining myself entirely after that. Not out of pride. Out of precision. Explanation invites negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating my worth. My days settled into a rhythm that looked unremarkable from the outside. Wake early. Look, read, listen. Occasional calls. Occasional silence. But beneath that calm surface, something fundamental was shifting. I was no longer reacting to loss. I was recalibrating power. When you lose status, people assume you lose access. That assumption is almost always wrong. What you lose is visibility. And visibility, I had learned, was overrated. I still knew people. People still talked. Systems still leaked information the way they always had. I simply wasn't expected to be paying attention. I received updates without asking for them. Fragments of conversation. Casual remarks passed along without caution. People spoke freely around someone they no longer saw as relevant. That invisibility became my advantage. The company I had left was struggling more than they admitted. Decisions made quickly after my departure were unraveling. Projects rushed. Costs underestimated. Blame already moving downward. I heard this not through official channels, but through exhaustion in voices I recognized. No satisfaction came with that knowledge. Just confirmation. At home, I sorted through what remained of my old life. Not sentimental objects. Documents. Agreements. Records. I wasn't searching for leverage. I was making sure I understood the full shape of what I had given and what had been taken. Understanding precedes closure. I remembered how often I had been asked to take on risk without authority, to lead without title, to protect others from consequences while absorbing them myself. That arrangement had worked beautifully for everyone except me. Until it didn't. One afternoon, I met with a former peer for coffee. Someone who had stayed. Someone who still wore the title I once carried. He spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't implicate him. He asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I'm learning. That answer unsettled him. He spoke about pressure. About unrealistic expectations. About leadership that wanted certainty without accountability. I listened. He asked if I missed it. I shook my head. What I missed was being heard. And I hadn't been heard in years. He hesitated, then said something revealing. He said the environment had changed after I left. That problems I used to intercept were now visible. That tensions I used to diffuse were escalating. You were stabilizing, he said. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind him that stability without recognition is exploitation. I let him sit with the realization. People don't like discovering the value of something only after it's gone. As we parted, he asked if I would ever consider returning. Not officially. Just in some advisory capacity. Quietly. Informally. I told him I would think about it. I already knew the answer. I wasn't going back to a structure that required my silence to function. But the invitation itself mattered. It confirmed something important. My absence was being felt. Quietly. Inconveniently. That's the kind of impact that lasts. At night, I reflected on my marriage with the same honesty. How much of myself I had compressed to fit a version of stability she admired. How often I had mistaken peace for connection. How easily affection had aligned with advantage. I didn't demonize her. People act in alignment with their values. Her values had simply become clearer when circumstances changed. Clarity doesn't require forgiveness to be useful. I began receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former clients. Old contacts. Individuals who remembered outcomes more than titles. They didn't ask where I worked. They asked how I thought. That difference mattered. I took some calls. Declined others. I wasn't chasing income. I was selecting environments. Places where insight mattered more than optics. Where consequences were shared, not delegated. One conversation stood out. A small group facing a familiar problem. Internal conflict. Leadership paralysis. Fear of speaking honestly. They didn't want a savior. They wanted a mirror. I agreed to listen. I didn't promise solutions. I asked questions. Uncomfortable ones. The kind that don't allow people to hide behind process or personality. The room went quiet more than once. Silence is where truth waits. By the end of that meeting, nothing had been decided. That was fine. Decisions made too quickly are usually made to relieve discomfort, not resolve it. As I left, one of them said something quietly. Not to impress me. Not for approval. We should have asked you years ago. I nodded. Timing is the most honest judge. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt since before everything fell apart. Alignment. Not excitement. Not relief. Alignment between who I was and how I was moving. I understood then that the loss of my job and my marriage hadn't stripped me of identity. They had stripped away distractions. I no longer needed to be loyal to systems that benefited from my silence. I no longer needed to be loved by someone who valued momentum over character. What I needed was patience. And I had that in abundance. Because when you stop trying to prove yourself, you give life space to reveal who notices, who listens, and who only stays when the ground is solid. And the ground beneath me was settling. Not with noise. Not with drama. But with a quiet certainty that something had shifted permanently, and that the people who had mistaken my calm for weakness were about to understand the difference. They blamed me for the collapse they caused after pushing me out, and that lie spread faster than the truth ever could. I didn't hear it directly at first. Lies rarely arrive openly. They travel through pauses, lowered voices, and careful rewrites of history. A former colleague hesitated on a call. Another avoided specifics. Then someone finally said it without realizing what they were revealing. They think you stopped caring near the end. I thanked him for telling me. That accusation was efficient. Clean. It solved their problem neatly. If I had disengaged, then their failures weren't failures at all. They were consequences of my absence. My supposed neglect. It was clever. And wrong. I didn't rush to correct it. Corrections sound defensive when the audience prefers comfort over accuracy. Instead, I listened. The story evolved quickly. I had been rigid, out of touch, unwilling to adapt. Words chosen carefully. None of them measurable. None of them provable. Perfect for internal circulation. The irony was quiet but sharp. For years, I had absorbed risk to protect leadership from exposure. Now those same leaders were shielding themselves by offering me up as explanation. That's when I understood the real conflict had finally begun. Not the loss of my job. Not the end of my marriage. Yes. Reputation is the last asset people try to seize when everything else slips. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't issue statements. I didn't demand meetings. I did something far more unsettling. I stayed consistent. I continued speaking thoughtfully on calls. Continued asking clear questions. Continued declining offers that lacked accountability. I didn't contradict the narrative. I let my behavior do that work over time. People pay attention when stories and reality don't align. The consulting group I had met earlier reached out again. Their situation had worsened. Internal disagreements. Missed deadlines. Leadership fatigue. Familiar patterns. They asked if I would step in more formally. I asked one question. Who decides when truth becomes inconvenient? Silence followed. Then an honest answer. That's part of the problem. Honesty matters. It doesn't solve everything, but it reveals where effort is worth spending. I agreed to help on a limited basis. Clear boundaries. Clear authority. Clear consequences. No ambiguity. That clarity changed the room immediately. I wasn't there to rescue anyone. I was there to remove confusion. Confusion is where manipulation hides. Word traveled faster this time. Not loudly. Accurately. People noticed the contrast. Calm discussions. Direct accountability. Problems named without theater. Solutions proposed without ego. I didn't advertise my involvement. I didn't need to. Meanwhile, the company I had left continued unraveling quietly. Delays became visible. Clients asked questions. Internal tensions leaked outward. The same people who had rewritten my past were now rewriting their forecasts. I was asked, indirectly, if I would speak on their behalf. Offer perspective. Provide reassurance. I declined. Not out of spite. Out of alignment. I wasn't going to stabilize a structure that required distortion to survive. The lie about me grew thinner as reality pressed against it. People began asking for specifics. Examples. Evidence. None came. Stories without substance don't age well. One afternoon, I received a message from someone high enough to matter. Carefully worded. Respectful. He wanted to clear the air. He said there had been misunderstandings. That perhaps decisions had been made too quickly. I read it once. Then I archived it. Clearing the air benefits the person who polluted it most. I wasn't interested in absolution. I was interested in outcomes. The work I was doing now produced results. Measurable ones. The kind that don't require explanation. That difference spoke louder than any defense I could offer. People began to recalibrate quietly. Invitations changed tone. Questions became more thoughtful. Assumptions softened. Not everyone reversed their opinion. Enough did. That's all it takes. I noticed something else during this time. The more stable my position became, the more distant she grew. Not angry. Not regretful. Distant. As if success confirmed something she needed not to revisit. People rarely return when leaving served their narrative. I didn't expect her to. What mattered was understanding that loss had stripped away false witnesses. Those who remained now did so because they saw clearly, not because they benefited conveniently. That's when I felt the tension shift. The conflict was no longer internal. It was no longer about recovery. It was about exposure. Not through confrontation. Through contrast. Because when calm competence stands next to manufactured authority, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. And the people who had mistaken my silence for absence were beginning to realize I had never stopped watching. I had simply stopped standing where they expected me to stand. And that miscalculation was about to cost them more than a rewritten story ever could. They didn't correct the lie because correcting it would have required admitting why it existed in the first place. Instead, they doubled down. That's what insecure systems do when pressure increases. They tighten their grip on the story rather than loosen their hold on reality. I began hearing new versions of myself. That I had resisted change. That I had slowed innovation. That I had become difficult near the end. None of these claims came with dates or decisions attached. Just impressions. Atmosphere. Emotion disguised as evaluation. It would have been easy to feel insulted. But insult requires attachment. And I was already detached. What fascinated me was how carefully the narrative avoided specifics. No one could point to a failed project I had led. No one could identify a warning I had ignored. The accusation survived only because it stayed vague. Vagueness protects liars. I didn't respond publicly. But I did something far more effective. I kept showing up exactly the same way everywhere else. Measured. Direct. The consulting work deepened. Not in scope, but in trust. People began speaking freely around me. Not because they feared me. Because they felt safe telling the truth. That safety produced clarity. Clarity produced momentum. Momentum produces enemies. I noticed resistance almost immediately. Passive delays. Questions framed as concern. Warnings delivered as advice. Familiar tactics. People protect confusion when it benefits them. I named it quietly. Not in meetings. Not in writing. In private conversations where performance has no audience. Where honesty costs something. Those conversations change things. People don't always need leadership. Sometimes they need permission to stop pretending. The group began making decisions that had been avoided for months. Accountability shifted upward. Responsibilities were clarified. Outcomes improved. No celebration followed. Just relief. Relief is the most honest metric of progress. At the same time, my old workplace continued its slow unraveling. The irony was that they tried to solve structural problems with cosmetic solutions. Rebranding language. Reorganizing teams. Hiring consultants to validate decisions already made. None of it addressed the core issue. They had built a system that punished truth and rewarded compliance. Those systems always fail eventually. I received another indirect inquiry. This one more careful. They wanted to know if I would be willing to advise discreetly. Not return. Not officially consult. Just help stabilize things behind the scenes. They didn't offer authority. They didn't offer accountability. They offered discretion. I declined again. Discretion without responsibility is how problems survive. I didn't explain my decision. Explanations invite bargaining. Bargaining invites compromise. I wasn't interested in compromise anymore. What surprised me was how quickly the request turned into resentment. Silence where politeness had been. Distance where neutrality had lived. Refusal reveals motives faster than agreement ever does. People who want your help conditionally never wanted your help. They wanted your cover. That clarity cost me nothing. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly. People outside both environments began connecting dots. Former colleagues spoke to current ones. Clients compared experiences. Inconsistencies surfaced. No one accused anyone openly. They didn't need to. Questions began to circulate. Simple ones. Why outcomes declined after certain changes? Why warnings had been ignored? Why stability vanished when one quiet presence was removed? Questions don't attack. They erode. I remained unavailable for comment. Not because I was hiding. Because I didn't need to speak. The truth was no longer mine to defend. One afternoon, someone forwarded me an internal message by mistake. It wasn't malicious. Just careless. It referenced the gap that had appeared after my departure. Not by name. Not publicly. But clearly. Gaps don't accuse. They expose absence. I didn't reply. I closed the message and went for a walk. Walking had become my way of marking time without rushing it. I passed houses where lights were on and curtains half drawn. Lives unfolding inside structures people assumed were permanent. I understood now how fragile permanence really is. I thought about how close I had come to believing their version of events. How easy it would have been to internalize the blame. To doubt myself. To accept their explanation because it was convenient. That's how quiet people are erased. They convince you to finish the work for them. I didn't. The consulting group asked me to stay longer. Not because they needed me, but because they trusted the environment that had formed. Transparency. Accountability. Calm decision-making. I agreed, but only temporarily. Dependency wasn't my goal. Sustainability was. As I prepared to step back, one of them said something that stayed with me. You don't fill space. You change how people behave in it. That was the first accurate description I had heard in years. It explained why my absence had been so disruptive elsewhere. Not because I was indispensable, but because I had altered the rules quietly. I had made truth normal. Calm expected. Responsibility shared. When that presence disappeared, old habits rushed back in. They always do. The lie about me had served its purpose for a while. It had delayed accountability. It had protected egos. But lies decay under consistency. I was consistent. And consistency, over time, becomes undeniable. The tension shifted again. What began as deflection was turning into quiet reckoning. Not public. Not dramatic. Just internal discomfort growing in places where certainty once lived. That's when I knew the story was no longer about what they said about me. It was about what they could no longer say without contradiction. And once contradictions settle in, collapse follows. Not loudly. Naturally. They never admitted the lie, but they stopped repeating it. That was enough. Silence replaced certainty. Not the calm kind. The cautious kind. The kind that follows when people realize a story no longer protects them. I noticed the shift first in tone. Messages grew formal. Invitations became hesitant. Words like alignment and next steps replaced confident declarations. Language always changes before power does. I wasn't involved in any of it directly. That was the point. The less I appeared, the more obvious the contrast became. Their explanations grew complicated. My absence stayed simple. Complication is a sign of decay. I focused on finishing my work with the consulting group cleanly. No dependencies. No unfinished threads. I made sure knowledge was shared, decisions documented, responsibility distributed. I didn't leave gaps for them to blame later. When I stepped away, the system held. That mattered. It proved something quietly but conclusively. Stability hadn't come from my presence alone. It had come from the standards I insisted on. Those standards didn't disappear when I did. That's real impact. Meanwhile, the old workplace continued adjusting. Leadership shuffled. Roles changed hands. People quietly repositioned. The ones who had been loud grew careful. The ones who had been quiet grew visible. I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in a long time. Short. Neutral. He said he hoped I was doing well, and that things were challenging on his end. I replied politely. Nothing else needed to be said. People reach out like that when they're testing the ground. Not for help. For reassurance. For signs of forgiveness. For evidence that consequences won't land too hard. I offered none of that. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Consequences aren't personal. They're structural. Once a system reveals itself, individuals simply experience what they helped maintain. I thought about reaching out to correct the record at one point. Not publicly. Privately. Just to set things straight. But then I realized something important. Setting things straight would help them more than it would help me. It would give them closure without accountability. So I let the discomfort stay where it belonged. At home, life had settled into something quieter and more precise. Fewer possessions. Fewer obligations. Fewer emotional negotiations. I knew exactly what I needed and what I didn't. That kind of clarity changes how you move through the world. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I wasn't trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. I wasn't interested in returning to structures that required my silence to function. The loss of my marriage felt different now. Less like abandonment. More like alignment revealing itself too late. We hadn't been moving toward the same future. We had just been sharing the same momentum. When the momentum stopped, the difference became visible. I didn't resent her for that. People choose what feels safe. She chose certainty. I chose truth. Those choices rarely lead to the same place. I received one final message from the old workplace. This one direct. Careful. Respectful. They asked if I would be open to a conversation about lessons learned. I smiled when I read it. Lessons learned are usually requested by people hoping to avoid naming mistakes. I declined politely. I didn't owe them insight. They had already received it. They just hadn't wanted to listen at the time. That refusal closed something permanently. The narrative about me didn't reverse. It didn't need to. It simply lost relevance. People stopped talking about the past and started dealing with the present. That's how quiet justice works. No declarations. No apologies demanded. No vindication performed. Just reality adjusting itself around truth. As I looked back over the months since everything fell apart, I saw the pattern clearly. Loss had removed noise. Silence had revealed character. Consistency had done the rest. I hadn't planned revenge. I had planned integrity. And integrity, when maintained long enough, becomes impossible to ignore. The people who had underestimated me weren't punished. They were exposed to the limits of their own systems. The people who had benefited from my silence weren't confronted. They were left without cover. That was enough. Because the most enduring consequences are the ones no one can argue with. They simply live with them. And as I moved forward, lighter and clearer, I understood something that would shape everything that followed. I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop carrying what was never mine to begin with. They tried to bring me back quietly, not because they respected me, but because the structure they built could not stand without what I had been carrying for them. The request didn't come directly. It never does when pride is involved. It arrived through intermediaries. Casual mentions. Questions framed as curiosity. Someone wanted to know if I would be open to a conversation. Someone else wondered if I had availability. Availability is a careful word. It avoids responsibility. I listened. I didn't respond. By then, I had learned something important. When people remove you and then struggle, they don't want correction. They want relief. And relief, if given too early, teaches nothing. The consulting work had given me distance. Distance had given me perspective. I could now see how deeply I had been embedded in systems that survived by redistributing pressure downward. I had been the pressure valve. Reliable. Replaceable. Until I wasn't. The turning point didn't announce itself dramatically. It came in the form of a document someone shared with me accidentally. A planning memo. Revised targets. Delayed milestones. Contingencies layered over contingencies. Fear written in professional language. I read it once and understood immediately. They weren't failing because I was gone. They were failing because truth had been absent long before I left. I had simply delayed the consequences by absorbing them quietly. That realization changed how I felt about everything. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt relieved. Relieved that I no longer had to protect a structure that refused to protect itself. I received a call from someone who mattered enough to be careful. He spoke slowly, chose words deliberately. He said the organization was reassessing past decisions. He said my name had come up in discussions about missed stabilizers. Stabilizers. Not leaders. Not contributors. Stabilizers. I let that word sit. He asked if I would consider a short engagement. Limited scope. Clear boundaries. Quiet involvement. I asked a question I already knew the answer to. Who takes responsibility if it doesn't work? Silence. That silence told me everything. They didn't want accountability. They wanted insulation. I declined again. Not with bitterness. With courtesy. Courtesy disarms entitlement. It leaves no angle to attack. After that, the requests slowed. Not because the need disappeared, but because hope did. They realized I wouldn't return under the old terms. And they didn't know how to offer new ones. Systems rarely do. At the same time, something else was forming quietly elsewhere. People I had worked with years ago reached out independently. Not connected to each other. Not coordinated. Each had a similar problem. Fragmentation. Internal mistrust. Fear of honest conversation. I noticed the pattern. These were places where truth had been delayed but not eliminated. Where people sensed something was wrong but lacked language for it. They didn't ask me to fix anything. They asked me to listen. Listening creates leverage. I agreed to a few conversations. No contracts. No promises. Just presence. I asked the same questions everywhere. Simple ones. The kind that expose assumptions rather than defend positions. What happens when this fails? Who benefits from this confusion? What truth are you avoiding because it threatens comfort? Those questions worked the same way every time. They slowed the room. Forced reflection. Removed performance. I wasn't providing answers. I was removing excuses. Word traveled quietly. Not as reputation. as relief. He doesn't rush us. He doesn't take sides. He says the things we keep circling. That kind of value doesn't scale loudly. It accumulates. I began to see my role clearly for the first time in years. I wasn't meant to belong inside one system. I was meant to move between them. To identify where silence had become policy. Where calm had been mistaken for consent. That realization felt like alignment settling into place. Meanwhile, she remained absent. Completely now. No messages. No logistical follow-ups. Nothing. The distance had finished its work. Whatever bond we once shared had been replaced by parallel lives. I didn't reach out. Some endings don't require closure. They require acceptance. I thought about how much of myself I had compressed to maintain stability. At work. At home. Everywhere. How often I had chosen peace over truth, believing they were the same. They aren't. Peace avoids disruption. Truth creates it. But disruption is sometimes the only path to stability that lasts. That was the lesson unfolding now. The turning point wasn't revenge. It wasn't exposure. It was position. I was no longer reacting to decisions made by others. I was choosing where to place my attention, my effort, my calm. That choice shifted the balance quietly but decisively. People noticed. Not because I announced anything. Because absence and presence are both forms of communication. And mine was now deliberate. I had stopped being available to systems that required my silence. I had started being present where truth was welcome, even when it was uncomfortable. That change didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. Because once you understand the role you were playing without consent, you can't return to it willingly. And the people who depended on that role feel the loss more deeply than any accusation ever could. They didn't need me to say anything. They needed me to stay gone. That was the moment I understood the quiet power of refusal. Not refusal driven by anger. Refusal grounded in clarity. The kind that doesn't argue. The kind that simply changes the future by removing itself from the past. And from that moment on, everything that followed would unfold naturally. Not fast. Not loudly. But in a way that could not be reversed. I watched quietly as the systems I had once supported stumbled without me. Not in dramatic collapse, not in chaos. Just a slow, uneven correction that exposed cracks no one had bothered to notice before. It started with missed deadlines, small miscommunications, little gaps in responsibility that had been invisible when I had been there. Those gaps had been covered effortlessly, silently, by someone no longer present. And now, they were visible. Obvious. Unavoidable. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't even angry. I was observing. Because observation is different than reaction. Observation gives you clarity, and clarity always precedes action. Calls came from people I hadn't spoken to in years, some tentative, some desperate. They weren't asking for solutions. They were asking questions I knew the answers to. And I gave answers selectively, carefully, without emotion. No one wanted advice from me. They wanted confirmation. Confirmation that their failures weren't theirs, but mine, or that I had the authority to fix them. I let them wait. Waiting sharpens insight. It separates need from urgency, clarity from panic. The quiet patience I had practiced for months was now paying off in ways I hadn't anticipated. People began to speak differently around me, not louder, not apologetically, just more honestly. Honesty spreads when it is no longer punished. Meanwhile, my old company continued as if nothing had happened. Their internal communications were polite, careful, constrained. Words were chosen to preserve appearances, not to solve problems. And yet, every misstep, every missed milestone, every delay was visible to those who knew what to look for. And I did. I began documenting everything in my mind. Not for leverage, not for revenge, not for validation. Simply for understanding. Patterns emerged. How decisions were made. How problems were escalated. How failures were explained away. How people protected themselves while others bore the weight. I didn't need proof. I needed clarity. At home, life remained calm. I had eliminated distractions, unnecessary obligations, anything that didn't contribute to clarity or peace. Meals were simple. Sleep was consistent. Walks became meditative. I noticed things I had ignored for years: the rhythm of morning traffic, the changing patterns of the neighborhood, the way light hit the kitchen in late afternoon. Life, I realized, continued with or without approval, with or without recognition. Her absence, too, had settled into a quiet presence. Not painful, not confusing, just factual. She had left, and that was that. The energy she once consumed was now mine. I didn't miss her. I didn't resent her. I simply recognized the freedom her departure had created. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It simply exists once the barriers are removed. The first time I realized how much control I had regained was during a routine call with the consulting group. They asked me to give a recommendation on a problem that had stymied their internal leadership. I listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then simply outlined the logic. No embellishment, no dramatics, just clarity. By the end of the call, one of them said, almost in awe, "That makes sense. Why couldn't we see it ourselves?" I smiled. Not for them, not for recognition, but for understanding. Insight becomes obvious when emotion is stripped from it. Meanwhile, rumors from my old workplace reached me. Stories about me. Not flattering ones. Not entirely accurate ones. But they were circulating in exactly the way truth often does. Quietly, measured, insidiously, until they meet resistance. People repeated the lies they needed, to avoid facing realities they hadn't wanted to address. I didn't respond. I didn't correct them. Lies thrive on attention. Remove the attention, and they weaken. The same month, I was approached by another company. Small, privately run, struggling with leadership issues that mirrored the problems I had helped others solve. They didn't offer a title. They didn't offer prestige. They offered challenges, clarity, and accountability. I accepted. Not because I needed to prove anything, not because I needed revenge. I accepted because it allowed me to operate in a place where honesty was respected, decisions had consequences, and calm action mattered more than appearances. At the same time, my old company's internal problems deepened. Delays grew longer. Miscommunication spiraled. Leadership appeared more uncertain. Employees who had once relied on my quiet guidance now floundered without it. And still, I remained outside. I watched the ripple effect. Every time someone tried to adjust for a failing project, every time blame was passed downward, every time shortcuts replaced thoughtful process, the consequences grew more visible. I didn't intervene. I didn't speak. I let it unfold. This was the power of absence. Teaches more than presence. It clarifies more than confrontation. It exposes gaps without aggression, reveals truth without noise, and allows natural consequences to settle in precisely where they belong. By this point, even she would have noticed, if she cared to. The life she had abandoned, the silence she had left behind, had created a space where clarity and patience could operate unchallenged. And clarity and patience do not rush. They endure, quietly, until results become undeniable. Every morning, as I walked through the neighborhood, I reflected on the contrast between who I had been when I was entangled in obligations and expectations, and who I had become through patience, calm, and deliberate observation. The difference was profound. It wasn't just professional. It was personal. It was moral. It was the knowledge that one does not need to act loudly to correct injustice. One only needs to act wisely and wait. And so, as the days passed, the turning point became clear. My presence, or absence, was no longer about employment or recognition. It was about influence. Subtle, inevitable influence. Influence that shaped decisions, revealed truth, and corrected errors without ever needing to confront anyone directly. By now, the systems that had once dismissed me were forced to reckon with the reality I had quietly established elsewhere. They didn't like it. They couldn't control it. And in that discomfort, the consequences of their previous disregard began to settle. not as spectacle, not as drama, but as the inevitable realignment that occurs when truth quietly asserts itself against lies, manipulation, and neglect. And in that quiet, deliberate space, I realized that the power I had always possessed had never depended on a job, a title, or even a marriage. It depended on patience, clarity, and calm action, the things no one could take from me. I understood then, fully, that the turning point wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about reclaiming control over the narrative of my own life. Not by shouting, not by demanding, not by confronting, but by living in a way that allowed natural justice, clarity, and consequence to unfold. And as I looked toward the future, I felt for the first time a steady certainty. The kind that doesn't need approval, the kind that doesn't fear silence, the kind that quietly assures you that time will reveal truth even when the world seems intent on hiding it. The quiet had become my ally. Observation had become my strategy. Patience had become my instrument. And the world, finally, inevitably, was responding. The subtle power of absence became unmistakable as weeks turned into months. What had once been invisible, the gaps left by my departure, the missteps previously absorbed, now dictated outcomes. Not dramatically. Not with fanfare. Just with the quiet inevitability of truth asserting itself where deception had once held sway. I observed without comment. I watched deadlines stretch longer than planned, minor errors accumulate into critical failures, and decisions made without scrutiny unravel slowly. Those who had once relied on my quiet guidance now struggled to compensate. Their frustration was visible, though rarely acknowledged openly. It wasn't vengeance, it was the natural consequence of a system built on borrowed integrity. Calls came from former colleagues, tentative, carefully phrased, as if they were testing the waters to see if I would intervene. They didn't ask for advice, they sought reassurance. They wanted confirmation that the gaps, the missteps, the failures were my responsibility to fix. And I let them wait. Waiting, I had learned, is more potent than any rebuttal. It allows truth to settle, exposes desperation, and separates genuine need from mere convenience. People reveal themselves in the pauses they cannot control. Meanwhile, my consulting work expanded in quiet ways. I was invited into teams facing challenges remarkably similar to those I had already resolved elsewhere. Conflicts rooted in avoidance, miscommunication, and a lack of accountability. I didn't step in to rescue anyone. I listened, asked questions, and clarified logic. I forced no one to act, yet the results emerged organically. Teams made decisions they had delayed for months. They confronted issues they had avoided for years. Accountability, once deferred, became the natural default. It was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniably effective. And word spread, not in headlines, not in gossip, but in careful, measured acknowledgments. He doesn't rush decisions. He doesn't take sides. He makes us see what we've been avoiding. That kind of reputation travels slowly, quietly, but it endures. Unlike noise, it cannot be ignored. Back at my former workplace, the story about me persisted, though it had begun to lose traction. Lies need an audience. Attention is their lifeblood. Without intervention, without emotional reaction, they withered. I did not correct them. I did not defend myself. I did not need to. Invisibility had become the most powerful form of influence. One afternoon, a former subordinate reached out, cautiously, almost apologetically. He spoke of the increasing pressure, of leadership missteps, of confusion that had grown since I left. He asked if I would consider a role, even briefly, to advise. I asked one question: who bears the consequences if we are wrong? Silence. That silence confirmed my decision. I declined. Not in anger. Not in pride. In alignment with principle. One does not step back into a structure that relies on deception and evasion to survive. Consequences must unfold naturally for lessons to take hold. At home, life had become precise. Meals were unhurried, sleep consistent, walks deliberate. The quiet around me mirrored the internal order I had cultivated. My personal space was free from negotiation, expectation, and distraction. Freedom, I realized, is not loud. It arrives once obligations, assumptions, and dependencies have been removed. Her absence, too, had settled into clarity. No messages, no interruptions, no attempts at reconciliation. That space, once filled with emotional labor, now allowed calm thought, deliberate observation, and focused action. I did not miss her. I did not resent her. I simply recognized the truth. Our paths had diverged, and the gap she left created the room for clarity I had long needed. In professional circles, my absence began to speak louder than my presence ever had. Systems that had dismissed me now confronted consequences that could no longer be ignored. Delays became measurable losses. Miscommunication became operational risk. Leadership failures could not be hidden behind rhetoric. The structure I had left, carefully maintained by my silent labor, revealed its true fragility in my absence. I received one final communication from a former superior. Polite, careful, restrained. They requested a conversation about lessons learned, an acknowledgement of oversight without public admission. I declined. I did not owe insight or guidance to those who had ignored truth when it mattered. Refusal, in this case, was more instructive than intervention could ever be. Observation, patience, and clarity had done the work I could not. The consequences of neglect and deception were evident, undeniable, and unavoidable. The people who had underestimated my calm now faced the reality of their own misjudgment. Their discomfort was natural. Their reckoning was quiet, measured, inevitable. I understood then that the turning point had not been the loss of employment, nor the absence of companionship, nor even the lies about me. The turning point was deliberate detachment. Strategic patience. Letting systems operate without interference until truth, naturally and inevitably, revealed itself. The power of quiet influence became unmistakable. I was no longer defined by position, relationship, or circumstance. I was defined by principle, patience, and perception. And in that definition, I found freedom, control, and moral clarity. I did not need to confront. I did not need to correct. I did not need to announce. The absence, the silence, and the calm observation had accomplished what confrontation never could. It allowed reality to assert itself with precision. And in the stillness that followed, I realized the most important truth of all. Sometimes the most effective revenge is not action at all. It is deliberate inaction, guided by clarity and moral resolve. The world adjusts itself when you refuse to participate in its false narratives. And in that adjustment, justice, subtle and inevitable, quietly unfolds. As I moved forward, light and clear, I understood. Influence is most potent when exercised without spectacle. Lessons are most permanent when allowed to emerge naturally. And the integrity you maintain in silence is more powerful than any words spoken in anger. The calm I had cultivated, the patience I had practiced, and the clarity I had insisted upon had become instruments of quiet transformation. And finally, I felt the enduring satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a story untangled, and a moral balance restored. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, completely, and irreversibly. I realized the real work began after the chaos had settled. The initial shock of betrayal, the sudden absence of stability, the quiet unraveling of systems, all of that had passed. What remained was a landscape I could now navigate deliberately, without distraction, without expectation, without illusion. The first mornings of this new phase were almost meditative. I walked the streets of my neighborhood, observing details I had ignored for years. The way the sunlight hit the windows, the cadence of passing traffic, the rhythm of conversations in cafes. Life moved on relentlessly, indifferent to the stories people told about me, indifferent to the misjudgments or assumptions that had marked my absence. That indifference was liberating. I began reconnecting with work, selectively. Not for prestige. Not for recognition. Not to reclaim what had been lost. I sought challenges, clarity, and moral alignment. Each engagement was chosen carefully. The people I worked with had to value truth over appearance, responsibility over convenience. That criterion narrowed opportunities, but it also ensured that every action I took had genuine impact. I discovered a surprising pattern. The quieter I was, the more influence I wielded. The less I asserted authority, the more decisions were made in alignment with the principles I valued. My absence from certain roles had forced others to confront realities they had long avoided. My presence in others created space for accountability, honesty, and deliberate action. It was a lesson I had long suspected but now saw in practice. True influence does not require loudness. It requires consistency, patience, and moral clarity. Meanwhile, the echoes of my past life began reaching me in subtle ways. Former colleagues, people who had once dismissed my contributions, started seeking guidance indirectly. Not publicly, not formally, but quietly, cautiously, as if admitting they had been wrong was itself dangerous. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know about the systems I had left behind. Their need did not disturb me. Their discomfort was natural. I had removed myself from dependency. I was no longer entangled in obligations I had never consented to. Freedom has a weight, and I could feel it settling in my chest, steady, calm, unshakable. One day, a familiar face from the consulting group reached out. He spoke cautiously, carefully, as if measuring my willingness. He asked for advice on a project fraught with internal tension. I listened. I asked questions, strategically. Not to manipulate, not to control, but to reveal clarity. He responded, not with solutions, but with insights of his own, as though the answers had been hidden inside him all along. That was the subtle power of patient guidance, enabling others to act honestly, decisively, and responsibly, without ever forcing them to see through your eyes. At home, I structured my life around calm and focus. Meals were intentional. Sleep was consistent. Walks became meditative, almost ritualistic. For the first time in years, I noticed the distinction between peace and complacency. Peace allows observation and understanding. Complacency allows deception to persist. I was firmly in the former, having eliminated distractions and obligations that had previously masked the truth. Her absence, too, had cemented clarity. I didn't miss her, and I didn't resent her. There was simply a space now, open, quiet, and undemanding. That space allowed me to think clearly about relationships, loyalty, responsibility, and the alignment between action and consequence. I saw with precise understanding where my effort had been invested fruitlessly in the past, and where it could now yield genuine results. Opportunities began appearing in patterns I recognized. Small companies, struggling teams, isolated projects, all approached me quietly, carefully, for guidance. They didn't want my authority. They wanted the clarity my presence encouraged. I accepted selectively. Each engagement had defined boundaries, and each allowed me to shape outcomes subtly, through observation, questioning, and patient influence. The contrast with my old environment became stark. I saw how systems that had dismissed me continued to falter. Leadership missteps, miscommunications, and lack of accountability compounded. People attempted to stabilize the structures I had left, but without the discipline, patience, and integrity I had enforced quietly, the efforts were flawed, hesitant, and ultimately insufficient.